This week on Notsam Wrestling, Evan Hunsey and Jason Eisner from Darkside of the Ring are here to talk about Abdullah the Butcher, Bruiser Brody, the Montreal Screw Job, and more. I'll tell you what I was doing in Montreal this week. There's a lot to break down. Superstar Shakeup Week this week on Notsam Wrestling.
This is Notsam Wrestling.
Introducing your host from New York, here is Sam Roberts.
Back on time, back at it again. Welcome to Notsam Wrestling. And what a week it's been. Back in the Notsam studio. We were a couple days late last week. Again, I apologize, but I'll tell you what was going on. I told you I was going to tell you what was going on. I'll tell you what was going on. So for those that don't know, I am a guest commentator this week on WWE Main Event. And, you know, I'm going to post something on social media, but of all the sort of surreal, full circle moments that have happened, you know, over the past few years, I guess, whether it's, you know, on my radio show on Sirius XM, whether it's here on the podcast, whether it's the stuff I've been doing with WWE, to be sitting at that commentary booth, at that broadcast booth, next to Byron Saxton and Renee Young and doing commentary for WWE is about as nuts as it gets. So, I mean, I had an absolute blast. By the time you hear this, it should be available on Hulu, I guess. You know, it'll be available on the WWE Network in a few weeks, I think. But WWE invited me to be a guest for the one episode of WWE Main Event, and it was awesome. You know, I did. So last week, the reason I was late with the podcast is because I was in Orlando for an afternoon, just kind of learning a couple tricks of the trade from some of the professionals at WWE before I headed to Montreal, you know, because I can't, it's very different from doing the kickoff show commentary. But I was able to pick up some tips, get back to New York, lay down this podcast, and then on Sunday night, head to Montreal, where I got to sit there and do commentary for Main Event, and it was pretty amazing, just being part of the whole process. You know, you go out right around 7:30. Raw is about to start at 8, but 7:30, you go out there, jump into the booth, boom, boom, boom. All of the people in the arena are already there. You're sitting down, and it's go, go, go. You have about maybe 30 to 60 seconds from the time you sit down until that Main Event music kicks. Byron Saxton is able to take over right away. Boom, boom, boom. First entrance comes out. Here comes a camera right in your face. It's time to introduce yourselves to the world. Incredible. Couple of matches. Here's what's going on there. Here's what's going on here. And I was there to simply give my opinion. I was there to they said, you know, I don't know anything about any sports. I'm not there to call moves or do anything like that. But I was there they said, you know, you give your opinion on the kickoff show. Let's hear you give your opinion on Main Event. Could be fun. And everybody did. I think I had a blast doing it. I would love to do more because it's one of those things where, you know, you go in for your first time and you go, man, that was fun. I wish I could do it more, not only because doing more fun things is even more fun, but it takes some time to get comfortable in that booth. It's a difficult thing to do, but, I mean, difficult in the best possible way. So I'm so psyched that it all went down. And then immediately after Main Event, you go, you stand up, you get out of there. Time to transfer over. Here comes Michael Cole. Here comes Corey Graves. See you later, Renee. Backstage, Superstar Shakeup's happening. I mean, to watch the moving parts of an episode of Monday Night Raw, specifically like the Superstar Shakeup, is unbelievable. It's like nothing else in sports, nothing else in entertainment. It is crazy that the WWE is able to pull this off week in, week out. It never ceases to blow my mind, especially everybody working behind the scenes. It is, you know, you hear things described as a well-oiled machine. It's a machine oiled as well the way no other machine is oiled. It's incredible. But speaking of Montreal and the fun time that I had there, I couldn't help but think about the fact that Montreal is the spot where one of the most famous, I'll say, betrayals in wrestling history happened. That, of course, it's called the Montreal Screw Job. Survivor Series 1997. Bret Hart is getting ready to go to WCW. He's instructed to drop the title to Shawn Michaels. He doesn't feel comfortable dropping the title to Shawn Michaels in Montreal. Won't do it. Bret and Vince McMahon work together to try to figure out alternatives to what Bret could do. Bret doesn't want to do it. Vince McMahon agrees to some kind of a schmoz ending. Then at the last minute, without Bret's knowledge, Bret gets put in the sharpshooter. The bell is rung, and Shawn Michaels is announced as the new WWE champion. Like nothing that had happened before in any sort of recent history. There are other examples of betrayals happening, but in terms of doing it on WWE pay-per-view in 1997 in the Attitude Era, it's just nothing like it had happened. Viceland, Vice's cable channel, Viceland, has a series out called Darkside of the Ring. And it's done by a couple guys. Evan Hunsey is the producer. Jake Eisner is the director. I got the chance to see a bunch of the episodes, including the episode that aired this week on the Montreal Screw Job. And I really like it. It's not perfect, you know, and there are people that have criticisms. You know, there were people who had criticisms over the Macho Man episode. I really got locked into the series with the Bruiser Brody episode. You know, I'm not one to judge if something is historically accurate when it comes to behind-the-scenes stuff. You know, if I watch a documentary and they go, this happened at Survivor Series and it happened at SummerSlam, I know. Okay, wrestling history, I know. But the behind-the-scenes stuff, I wasn't there for it. So all I do is read the rumors and whatnot. There are people who have criticized this episode of Viceland's Dark Side of the Ring about the Montreal Screw Job. I watched it, and to me, I was entertained. I didn't feel railroaded by the whole thing. I don't know. But I would recommend that you watch it and form your own opinions. They talk to a bunch of people. They talk to Earl Hebner. They talk to Scott Hall. They talk to Vince Russo. They talk to Jim Cornette. They talk to Bret Hart. It really is. I mean, I just think it's cool to see wrestling documentaries that have had this much work put into them, right? These are not half-assed shows. Wrestling documentaries that have had this much work put into them be shown on a mainstream level the way they're shown on Viceland. So I got the chance to talk to the producer and the director of Dark Side of the Ring about the Montreal Screw Job, about Abdullah the Butcher and Bruiser Brody and all the other shows that they've done, and I wanted to share that conversation with you. So this week on the podcast, from Dark Side of the Ring, director Jason Eisner, producer Evan Hunsey are here. Let's get to it.
The Not Sam Wrestling interview.
Today on the podcast, I think a very special appearance. You know, we were talking earlier about Montreal. Raw was in Montreal. SmackDown was in Montreal this week. And I thought two guys that would be good to talk about Montreal as well as several other controversies are the producer and the director of a pretty amazing documentary series that's on Viceland right now. A lot of wrestling fans are talking about it, so hopefully you guys have already seen some of it. It's called Dark Side of the Ring, and with me here on the show is Evan Hunsey, who's the producer, Jason Eisner, who's the director. What's going on, guys? What's the haps?
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I'll tell you, Evan reached out to me about the project a couple of weeks ago, and I hadn't heard about it until you reached out, Evan, and to tell you the truth, like when you kind of explained what it was and what the title was, I was a little hesitant about it because the last thing that I kind of want for wrestling and that as a wrestling fan that I want to see at this point in my life is another one of these movies or series or whatever about how, you know, wrestling is so evil and everybody dies young and it's terrible for everybody. So I was like kind of worried that it was going to be one of those hatchet jobs from a fan perspective that, you know, they say, well, it's just wrestling fans talking about it. And it's like, no, you're being, you know, extraordinarily negative about something that's done a lot of good for a lot of people. But then I watched it, luckily. And what you do is you take kind of, I don't want to say an urban myth, but you take a story that happened inside the world of wrestling and you spend about an hour breaking it down. It's not about, you know, how evil wrestling in general is. It's just a really, I think of the ones that I've seen, well done telling of some of these stories that are darker, but just stories that aren't told. Like for me, I think my favorite one that I've seen so far is the Bruiser Brody documentary, where you guys go into everything that happened to Bruiser Brody getting killed in Puerto Rico and what the buildup was to it and why he was there and what people thought was going to happen and why it just kind of floated away with nobody ever getting kind of held to the coals for it or anything like that. And I was like, okay, this is actually right up my alley. And this week, you guys did something that I think is actually, I don't know if risky is the right word, but challenging, I think, is the right word. When I go, okay, so the Bruiser Brody, to tell the story of Bruiser Brody, even though the story's been told 100 times, I still feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, as filmmakers, that one's probably a little bit easier only because the mainstream haven't necessarily all heard the Bruiser Brody story. That story, I don't think I've seen has been told as accessibly as this documentary did. And the same thing for the Von Erich story. And the same thing for a few of the episodes. But when I found out that you guys were doing the Montreal Screw Job, I went, okay, now this is a story that's been told every way since Sunday. I feel like every angle has been exhausted. So when I heard you guys were doing it, I said, okay, I'm interested in the challenge. How did you guys tackle a story that, unlike a lot of the other stories you're telling, has been told over and over again?
Well, yeah. So when we wanted to do the show in the first place, when we were putting it together, we really wanted to engineer it to be something that non-wrestling fans could really be swept up into. And one of the key themes that's present in all of the episodes of the show is this sort of convergence of, real life and the sort of scripted world, if you will, of wrestling. And the Montreal Screw Job really seems to be like the lightning rod of that. That's the moment kind of when the curtain was pulled back, the fourth wall was broken, and it's such an important part in wrestling history. And, when we put the show together, it's like we wanted it to be accessible to so many people who've never heard of the story before. And that's what we really tried to do with this episode is kind of give like a crash course on it, but also try and find some information that hasn't been out there before.
Yeah, and we're very passionate fans, and we wanted this in some ways to kind of be like a gift to other wrestling fans so that they could show it to their like friends and family, and hopefully that they could like get a better understanding as to like why we are all like so passionate about this business. And those have been, for us, some of like the best compliments when we hear that like viewers have been showing it to their family and they say like, oh, my family member wasn't a wrestling fan and they watched this and now they're like addicted to it and they can't wait to watch the next one. Like that's like the best compliment. Exactly.
So as far as like the Screw Job as an episode, it's so important in the story that is wrestling. And so the way we approached it was literally involving all of the saga and like story and lore and mythology around it. Like, for example, the Bret Hart Wrestling with Shadows documentary, which was chronicling that as it was happening, is also part of our story because it is part of the story. So it is kind of like a 22 years later examination of it. And there is a little bit, and for all the hardcore fans, people have heard it to death. There is a new bit of information there, which is pretty key to the puzzle that's never been out before.
So a couple of things there. First of all, I mean, I think you guys are right on the money in what you were going for, because as soon as I started watching any of the docs in the series, really, I realized like, oh, this is something that I could actually turn on and watch with my wife. I mean, she's so sick of wrestling being on all the time. She couldn't possibly care less. But I go, this is because the emphasis is on the story, and it's not so. It's just I think every episode has been that way. It's just the fascinating stories that take place inside the business that really, unless you are deeply rooted as a fan, you probably don't understand. So I think you guys were super successful in making these stories accessible in that way. I thought the Wrestling with Shadows thing, and I'm glad that you guys included it, because to me, one of the things that I like about several of the docs in this series is that you get a whole bunch of different angles. You get several different perspectives of people who I think this is what happened and here's why. I think that's what happened and here's why. You kind of try to do a documentary in the truest form, which is not giving the answer as opposed to just you documenting what happened, and then the viewers at home can give the answer. But I feel like it stuck out to me like having Scott Hall on the show, and still, it blew my mind that still now Scott Hall thinks the whole thing was a work. But I feel like the fact that they were doing Wrestling with Shadows in that period of time, and they got so much backstage footage that literally nobody has ever gotten in the world of wrestling. And they happen to get it as the most sensational backstage story of the modern era was happening. I feel like the Wrestling with Shadows documentary has actually added to the mythology that Scott Hall put forward that the whole thing was a work.
Well, there's an interesting story about Scott Hall's, the genesis of putting Scott Hall in this episode, which is just basically I had lunch with him one time. And I was like, yeah, so we're doing an episode on the Montreal Screw Job. And he's like, total work, And I was like, and I was like, really? And
yeah, which is so crazy because he's like, such good friends with Shawn Michaels. They've been colleagues for so many years.
Yeah.
You think,
if anybody's close to it, it would be him, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so the the whole meta-ness of all of this is like, I've seen some people who are gearing up to watch this episode, which is premiering this week, is that like, well, why is Scott Hall in it? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, you have to convey to people that there is a side of this story where people believe this thing is a work. And actually on Twitter, we posted, kind of like, what do you think? And we were surprised at how it's kind of almost 50-50.
Yeah, still to this day.
Well, my whole thing is that I could understand believing in that theory when it first happened, and even for a year or so after it happened. But when you look back on it, while WWE benefit in the long run, if you piece the story together in a certain narrative, you could definitely make the argument that WWE benefited tremendously from it. I mean, I think the popular narrative is that the Mr. McMahon character, which ended up being the hottest bad guy character in wrestling, stemmed from this incident. Now, I don't think that was on purpose. I think it just kind of happened. Yep. But realistically, sending Bret Hart to WCW did nothing for anybody. You could easily make the argument that this was the end of Bret Hart's career. Nothing after this incident was good for Bret Hart in wrestling. So I don't understand from all points of view why on the Bret Hart side he would have agreed to this work, and since it didn't work out for him, why he wouldn't have said something within the last 20 years.
Well, it's kind of amazing to like fantasize about the idea of like a work to the grave, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing cooler than that, I think, And so like, because we've heard stories about, when you rib someone to the grave, but like, so that, in theory is incredible. But we know firsthand from being, with spending time with Bret and literally hearing him talk about this story for so long. I mean, sometimes when in some of the other interviews, which we can talk about that we've done on the other episodes, like, when someone's kind of working you a little bit, you know, and in this, I didn't get that. I just got, bitterness and,
Yeah. And Bret's story has literally been the same, like all these years.
Pretty much.
Like it's never changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that adding Vince Russo to the mix, I think it was strong for you guys to do that. I think that the prevailing theory, Vince Russo gets left out of a lot of this stuff because his reputation is what his reputation is. But realistically, if you're doing a documentary and you've got Cornette and you've got Hebner and you've got Hart, whether you believe him or trust him or whatever it is, you've got enough counterpoints of view represented in the thing. Why not throw Vince Russo in there?
Yeah, well, it wasn't originally in the cards to have him involved with the episode. We were actually interviewing him for another episode of the show, and he basically demanded that he be part of this episode.
And he's like, because I think we left it in there where he's like, I wasn't slated for this documentary,
Yes.
but And so
I was there, so I have to like talk about it.
Which is great. So that's like a real, like he literally like the documentary, like it puts we put the brakes on for Russo to do a run in. But
That's what it felt like. It felt like an old school run-in where Russo just takes the thing over, and then all of a sudden, towards the end of the episode, it kind of drifts away from Bret Hart's story to, did you guys know how much Jim Cornette and Vince Russo hate each other? and there it is.
Yeah, that was also, I mean, that's also entertaining, as well. But for us, like, I guess, like, one of the reasons why we did that is it is fascinating when at the core of this story, you have this bitter rivalry between Bret and Shawn, like two people who hate each other, they can't get along. But then if you peel the layers back of the onion, like here you have, Cornette and Russo who also hate each other. And that just proved to be, one of the more fascinating like aspects of the story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's like, egos are colliding still to this day over this story.
Yeah, that you would think that the contention lies between the main parties involved, whether it's Bret Hart and Vince McMahon or Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, not realizing that there is so much just bubbling under the surface between two guys who were writing the show at the time.
Yeah, and one of the more fascinating aspects in that sequence between Cornette and Russo that's so weird to me, because I think this is totally singular in the wrestling business, is where you have two guys who are arguing over taking credit for something that they wish they didn't take credit for. Which to us is like amazing.
Yeah, you wouldn't get that in any other art form.
No, it's incredible. It's incredible. Now, as the filmmakers, do you sit there and after you're done or after you do the interviews, do you try to figure out like, okay, here's who I believe? Or do you sit there and go, I just want to make a great product and, this is the story. There's 100 versions of it. Let's just put it out there.
I think it's a mixture of a little bit of both, but it's definitely, we get swept up into this. Definitely. I mean, we lived and breathed and slept, all of this we like lived it for a couple of years. So every time we would interview or talk to somebody else and some new bit of information would come out or we would get worked, or something, we were always dissecting that,
Oh yeah. On like the drive, like back from like interviewing them. We were like, okay, what was a work? Like, or we were just like exhausted from being worked so hard. Like, for example, like when we hung out with Abdullah the Butcher for a day and a half, like, we were just worked so much, couldn't get worked anymore.
Was that the one, or were there any interviews or moments where you come off of it and you think you have this gem, and then either somebody tells you it's completely false, or you just sit with it for a day and a half and go, oh wait a minute, I was swept up. That's not even possible. That's a complete fabrication.
I think there are. I think you'll see, for one example, like in the Fabulous Moolah episode, we interviewed Wendy Richter, and there was definitely like some moments in there where we're like, oh man, I think we got work. Like we didn't know we got work in the moment, but then maybe it was in the editing room. We're like, oh gosh, we're getting worked.
We're getting worked in the edit here. And that's a fascinating thing you just brought up, Jason, is like the Montreal Screw Job, obviously, but a lot of people point back to the Wendy Richter story as kind of one of the early more modern screw jobs.
Yeah,
and that to us, there was a detail in the edit room where we realized we got worked, which was when she claims that she didn't know the Fabulous Moolah was under that mask, and we're just thinking, how is that possible?
Yeah,
is she protecting the business still? Because we found that a lot. With a lot of the people from that generation that we were interviewing, especially Abdullah, shout out to Abdullah. He definitely was working us, but like still protecting the business. And that's when we realized, well, wait a minute, how could you not know? And so that was kind of a fascinating moment.
But we admire being worked too.
We do. We love it. Yeah,
sure.
We love it. We're just like, this is great, because it is like being a fan. We have the responsibility of kind of balancing being big time fans, but also being filmmakers / journalists, I guess you could say, with this show. So, we also, have some responsibilities in that regard too.
Yeah.
Well, it's really funny, especially with the Abdullah stuff, because you're going, okay, like you're speaking in your normal speaking voice. So you're already completely breaking character. When you get that high pitched, like Southern accent, clearly not Abdullah the Butcher. You're just a guy now. So you would think that once you break that wall okay, now we're out of character. But for some reason, he's okay revealing that part, but still these other elements. He's got I think all the old school guys and women have this invisible line that is different for everybody of when it's okay to kind of draw back the curtain and what there. But then there's a second curtain that you didn't even know about that they still keep other stuff behind that one.
Totally. For Abdullah the Butcher specifically, you know, when we took him to Red Lobster the day before, you know, he was from, you know, the Abdullah the Butcher from the Sudan, you know, at this meal we were having. And then when we sat down and did the interview the next day with him, you know, same kind of thing where I felt like we were talking to the character, you know, we were doing a promo. And so, and it's really hard to convey to him like what we're looking for. And like the whole eureka moment of getting Abdullah the Butcher to kind of crack, so to speak, was the moment when we played him footage of Bruiser Brody. And we played like these old videos he probably hasn't seen 25, 30 years of the matches they had. And then that's what cracked the facade. And then he teared up. You'll see it in the episode. And then he started to kind of be, you know, taking us a little bit more seriously, I think, from that point on.
You know, that makes a lot of sense because as you watch the Brody episode, I felt like Tony Atlas did a pretty tremendous job of really helping narrate that story from a first-person perspective. And I kind of expected there to be a lot more Abdullah stuff, a lot more stories from Abdullah, but the fact that it took forever just to get him out of character is probably why you didn't have more kind of footage of him just being himself and talking about Bruiser Brody.
Yeah, like, gosh, like, as crazy as it was and how much we worked, I would have loved to have spent, like, a few more days with Abdullah because, like, people forget, like, he, like, wrestled in the 50s.
Yeah.
You know, like, he has been in it so long, and I imagine just has, like, so many incredible stories. But, like, we heard even, like, from Bret Hart, like, how, like, when Bret was a kid, he saw a match between his father, Stu Hart, and Abdullah. And he was terrified, and he saw, like, Abdullah was biting onto Stu Hart's face. And so he ran up, and he kicked Abdullah in the ass, and Abdullah turned around with Stu's blood all over his mouth and just growled at Bret. And we were like, Bret, like, where did you think Abdullah was from then? He was like, honestly, like, I thought they brought him in from like the darkest parts of Africa, not knowing that he's also a Canadian. And,
from the suburbs of Windsor, Ontario.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I love like we also like are obsessed with the idea of like that time period when wrestlers kept their families in the dark about the business.
Yeah.
You know, that their families were watching these matches thinking that, you know, everything that was happening was like really
real.
happening.
Yeah, it was a documentary before their very eyes. And the best example of that, which kind of even still answers your question, which is for the Moolah episode, we interviewed Princess Victoria, who, you know, was a pioneering female wrestler
from Vancouver.
Yeah.
If you don't know her after you see the episode, you're gonna love her. She's
By the
like
way,
one of our favorite people to interview.
And I'll tell you that this is already taking off because I saw an ad. She's doing conventions again. And
amazing.
I saw this picture of her and I was like, where do I know her from? And I had just watched the Moolah episode. And I went, that's what it is. But
that's
go on.
So cool.
She was the most unexpected, like what a surprise she was like when we arrived at her home and did this interview with her, just how amazing she is, her stories are, and what she's lived through and been through is just insane. You could do a movie about her. And she told us this story that I think is just so wild to think about.
I love it, yeah.
And it's one of my favorite road stories that we have, I guess you could say, that we unfortunately couldn't find room for in the episode itself, but we will release as its own thing because it's that crazy. But basically, there was an intergender match that she was in like the late 70s or the early 80s, which is crazy that happened then.
Yeah.
It was like an 8-man battle royale.
It was an 8-man battle royale. She was the only woman, and it came down to her and Buddy Rose. And the whole angle they were working at the time was, you know, Buddy Rose was the heel, and he's saying, you know, how women don't belong in wrestling, and she's like, you know, I can do anything a man can and better, and that was the whole angle going into it. And there's a spot in the match where Buddy Rose takes Princess Victoria and slams her head into a brick wall. And she falls to the floor, and everyone in the audience is like gasps. And then she stands up, and her face is just, you know, she's covered in blood. She's got the crimson mask, you know, and everyone's just like, oh my God, you know. And then all of a sudden her brother is in the audience and he is like, oh my God, someone's trying to kill my sister. And so he runs over the guardrail, gets right in front of Buddy Rose's face and is like, you take your hands off my sister. And then like the security guards, like tackle him and, get him out of the arena. And then she goes to the back after the match and all the boys in the locker room are just like, who was that guy? Who was that? And she's like, that was my brother. And they thought it was the coolest thing that she didn't smarten up her family, to this whole business and did like the blade job or whatever.
Yeah, and she still didn't smarten him up. She was like, listen, this is like what I do for a living, and you can't do that.
Yeah, you can never interrupt me in a match. This is what I do.
And then also, like, when we asked her, we were like, so, like, to like Juice, did you like gimmick yourself? And she like paused and she was like,
she looked at us horrified, like,
she's like, how do you know that?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And she was like, I can't physically like tell you how I did. Like, I just can't. Like, I want to, but I can't within me like do it. She just physically couldn't do it.
Yeah.
And that was like such a.
It felt like Dave Schultz was going to materialize and slap the shit out of both of us.
Yeah.
You're just going to get your eardrums popped out.
Yeah.
So, like, on that note, I guess, you guys are obviously such huge fans, but you're also trying to get something done, trying to get, it is a pretty big undertaking. How much discipline does it take as filmmakers to go like, no, we can't just spend 3 weeks with Abdullah the Butcher asking him every question we were ever curious about. We actually have to stick to topic here and try to get something for the film, not just something that's like, when are we ever going to have this moment again? Let's just ask everything we ever wanted to know.
Yeah, I mean, it was tough to fit everything in sometimes just one day. And sometimes, you'd interview someone like Kevin Von Erich for his episode, which was spread apart over a couple of different days. But for the most part, it's like we had to phrase each question very carefully because, again, going back to the idea that this show is supposed to be engineered for non-wrestling fans, we literally had to phrase the questions being like, okay, for someone not familiar with wrestling, how would you describe this? And it caught them off guard, because sometimes you'd be talking to Jim Cornette and you'd ask him a question and he'd be like, well, that thing was a shoot and it was a work and then he pancaked and went to the back and gigged himself, or whatever. And it's like, that doesn't mean anything to anybody.
Yeah, but there were definitely like questions, that like were on our hearts that we like wanted to ask that were outside of the episode that like hopefully, if we wanted to capture them as like historical like documents in a way, so that like maybe after we're gone, someone will dig up that footage to like, find some information. And so hopefully we captured some things that could, be used for the history books later.
Yeah. Like, for example, we have Scott Hall's reaction to Macho Man's rap album. Which I think people are going to want 20, 30 years from now.
They're definitely going to want that. So how do you, because, I mean, a lot of people have tried to do wrestling documentaries. Some of them amazing, fantastic. Some of them are, low budget garbage that, you've seen it all. If you're fans, you know how wide that spectrum runs. How do you go to somebody like a Kevin Von Erich and say, look, I want to do a movie about the most painful things that have ever happened in your family. Or Tony Atlas, hey, remember when your friend died in a locker room in front of you? I would like to do a movie about it and talk to you about it. Or really, you have those people for every story that you tell. How do you go to them and go, hey, look, I promise you we're going to do it respectfully. We're the guys that you should talk to about this?
Well, it's not easy. First off, most of it was a relationship building with each of these people and kind of earning their trust and really just kind of being genuine and saying, hey, we want to give you the platform to tell your story and we don't have an agenda. Like, yeah we're fans, but we're not like, blinded by that. And we just want to give you that platform. And I think the wildest example of that is, we have an episode about Gino Hernandez, which is part of the series, who is a wrestler that is a little more obscure, but he was like an incredible heel in the 80s in Texas, and he unfortunately died under very bizarre, mysterious circumstances, and we were basically just set out to investigate that. And the biggest breakthrough we had on the episode was getting to his family, his mother being alive still. She's in her late 70s, and we got to talk to her and she's never talked to anybody, I think, even outside of her immediate family about what happened. And so for us, it was literally, I flew out there to meet with her with no cameras, and I spent a whole entire day with her and their family just going through old photos and just talking about, her son and everything, and just being respectful and genuine. And we built that layer of trust. And then it was like, okay, then I'm going to come back here in a few weeks, and then we'll shoot this. So sometimes it would go to that extent of just, really getting to know somebody, because you're telling her story, which is about the loss of her son, which is, an incredible tragedy.
Yeah.
And so you just have to be genuine.
Yeah. And also, for example, like when we went to interview Kevin Von Erich and Kauai, I think like at first, like he was really guarded and thought, like, because of like every other documentary that's been done about his family, he felt that they just like buried his father, Fritz. And he thought, and when we first started interviewing him, every question returned back to him defending his father.
Yeah.
And we had to take him to the side and just say, listen, man, like, we're like huge marks for your father.
Yeah.
Like, we have so much respect for your father. Like, you have no idea. And we showed him, actually, we cut a little trailer for the Bruiser Brody episode because we had already shot it then. And him and his two sons watched the trailer. And Kevin, after seeing it, was like, oh, this is like the Thin Blue Line. And we're like, oh, you feel that documentary?
Yeah.
And then we just like started talking about like documentary films that he loves. And then he just
got it.
Yeah, he got it totally. And so then when we sat back down, he was
totally
just like
different.
on. Yeah.
And just really quick to throw on top of that too, Brody, the story of Bruiser Brody got us scored so many points with so many people. Like we were legitimate if we were Brody people. You know what I mean? Like everyone respects Brody. So
that was the same with Brett as well.
Well, I was just gonna say, like Brett, the first time we talked to Bret Hart, he was like, well, I've told my story, already. And, I've said everything I wanted to say. And then it was like, well, we did this story about Bruiser Brody and we talked to his family, and then immediately he had stories about Brody. And then he was like, okay, let's do it, boys.
Yeah, because I guess like when he was young coming up in the business, I think maybe when he was like Cowboy Bret Hart or whatever.
Stampede era.
Yeah. He like a lot of the boys in the locker room didn't have a lot of respect for him, and it was Brody that like put him over to the rest of the boys. That they started respecting him, and he never forgot that, and has always appreciated that. So
yeah, that might be the reason why we were able to do this episode.
Yeah.
The Bruiser Brody thing is so interesting to me because I just feel like for somebody that was only around in the era that he was around in, that really did nothing in the WWF, he wasn't there to do anything outside of, World Class was about as close as he got to a national territory, right? But there's just something about him. And it's not even just the way he died, because I, as a kid, like as a tape trader growing up, I was obsessed with Bruiser Brody before I knew the story of how he died. It didn't have anything to do with that. It was just something about him. My cat's name was Bruiser Brody. Like I was obsessed with Bruiser Brody, never having been around to see him wrestle live and not knowing until later the story of his death. It was just watching those old World Class tapes and the old matches with Abdullah and just seeing how like so crazy far ahead of his time he was. And just not only like the size and the believability, but the charisma that this guy had without ever saying anything. Yeah. It was like I still don't know that that's been matched.
Yeah, there's something about him that even like my girlfriend, who she's definitely a wrestling fan, but she didn't know about Bruiser Brody until before this, and her just like watching footage of him. And not knowing anything about him. There's just something about his presence that is on a level in which, like you said, is unmatched. And the interesting thing about that is for us, the genesis of this show, like this show was founded on us discovering Bruiser Brody together.
Yeah.
Of literally, like, he wasn't part of our childhood. It was a little bit before our time. But going back and watching these old videos and these old matches and just being like, oh my God, like this dude is, like you were saying, is legitimate.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like the way he like comes into the ring and like there's just like a swagger about him that's just like it's like he just doesn't give a shit, but he's just like the coolest guy. I don't know. It's like even just watching him lace up his boots, it's like,
Yeah.
I don't know. There's like an energy about it that it's so legit. It's like so real.
Yeah.
And there's been so many guys that have tried to mimic Bruiser on so many different levels. I feel like Bruiser Brody was such a layered character that, like, you see, like, you know, you can see the Berserker in the early 90s is just doing that version of Bruiser Brody. And throughout, I mean, there have been so many versions of this guy that people are just kind of looking up to. I think when I was tape trading when I was in high school, and one of my first real favorite gets that I had was a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of the cage match between Bruiser and Lex Luger.
Yeah.
When Luger goes in, Bruiser is no-selling, and he gives him about 5 seconds, and all Lex can do is just climb over the cage and run back. Forget it. I'm done. Forget it.
Yeah. And there's so many amazing stories that we've heard on the road from people about, you know, about his temperament when it came to business. And like we David Manning, who's in several of our episodes, he was the referee and part booker of World Class Championship Wrestling, and he always tells this amazing story of when Frank would travel to other territories, and if the promoter didn't, you know, pay him like Frank wanted him to, Frank being Bruiser Brody, he would just basically go out into the match and he would get in the middle of the ring and he would lie down in the middle of the ring with all the fans there and everything until the promoter would literally come out and pay him in front of everybody.
Yeah. Or he would like go back and he would grab the mop out of the mop bucket and he would just go up into the stands and just start like splashing all the fans.
It's amazing.
Just wicked. Yeah. Yeah.
So in this week's episode, in the Montreal episode, I thought one of my favorite points of view, I guess, in this one was the Earl Hebner point of view. And I know that Earl has talked about it before, but I feel like I don't remember ever seeing it done as cohesively and as complete as is in this. I mean, I think his additions and the way he got into the position that he's in. I mean, like the little things, like Bret Hart having him come up to first class, you know? Like I thought there's this, Bret Hart talks about, and Earl says that this is what happened, that the night before when they're flying into Montreal for the show, Bret's sitting in first class and a stewardess comes back and gives Earl a first class ticket and says, you know, this guy wants you to sit with him up in first class. And there's Bret Hart, and just the level, because, you know, for us fans in 1997, even now really, but in 1997, the idea that there would be a screw job, like a real life screw job, not a storyline screw job, unfathomable. It hadn't, I don't think it had happened in WWE since the Wendy Richter thing in the early 80s. But the idea that Bret was so kind of conscious of the fact that something was going weird and that there was something screwy happening, that he gave Earl Hebner a first-class ticket next to him just to make sure that Earl and him were on the same page. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
Maybe Stu told him to do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, Earl was, there's a great story about Earl.
Yeah. Earl is still haunted by this every single day.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the things, and hopefully it comes through in the episode, but one of the things about it is, like, a lot of people tend to focus on, you know, with this story specifically is, you know, the Bret factor, the Shawn factor, and the Vince factor. And you kind of forget about Earl a little bit because, you know, he's the person that actually had to do this and had to wear the blame for so long. I mean, Bret didn't talk to Earl for decades.
Earl's the one that pointed at the timekeeper. He's the one that waved the hand at the bell, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's had to endure. I mean, he breaks down in the episode mostly because he lost a friend, and the other part is because, you know, for so many years, and now he's kind of embraced it, but for many years he had to endure those, you know, "you screwed Bret" chants. I mean, even at All In, I was at All In last year, and he was there, and they were chanting that.
Yeah. He said he didn't go to Canada for like years, like later, right?
Which is a great segue to one of the thing that happened, the experience we had with Earl.
Yeah.
Which was, so we have several associate producers that work on the show that help us out, you know, with this. We had an amazing team on the show, and Earl, like booking Earl, so to speak, for this episode was handled through a colleague of ours. And I wasn't. I think we were on the road.
We were
at the
on the
time.
road,
We were
yeah.
on the road or something. And so all the details were sorted through there. And Earl basically, we had set up like an Airbnb to shoot the interview at, and so it was downtown Richmond because he lives in Virginia, and we show up to this spot, and Earl is scoping out the building.
Yeah, he like parked his truck like down the street and is like kind of like looking around, and we're like, hey, like how's it going? And he's like really standoffish at first.
Yeah.
And like we bring him in, and he's like kind of like slowly like looking around, and then eventually admits to us that like.
No, it was like right before we were rolling. He's like, "Can I tell you guys something?" And we're like, "Yeah, sure, man. What's going on?" And he's like, "I thought y'all were gonna kill me." and 100% shoot. This is for real. And he basically had assumed that because we were sending him to what was, I guess, a bad neighborhood in Richmond, it was just a warehouse loft, just to make the interview look good. And he shows up there, and then he's like, well, how come the guy that booked the interview is not going to be there? And these guys are coming from Canada because the show was actually produced out of Toronto. And he's like, these guys are coming from Canada to meet us in this warehouse in the middle of downtown Richmond. And he was like texting his wife, like, I'm okay. And
and he was gonna like he was gonna bring a friend who was a cop to like come and knock on the door in case bullet shots started going through this door. They would hit this cop, I guess, before they would hit Earl.
A human shield
shot for him.
So he thought basically he thought this was like the scene in Goodfellas at the end when Robert De Niro is trying to get Karen to no, the other store. Yeah, down there. Yeah, that door right in there.
Yeah, totally.
Well, the other thing too is that when he showed up like 2 hours earlier for the interview to scope out the whole situation. And we're like, what are we going to do with him? Like, we're not ready. We're not ready. And so I remember like you and I were arguing, and we're saying, well, why don't we just get some B-roll? Just like get some B-roll of Earl. And so we brought the camera down, and thank God he started we're talking about something else, because I was literally going to say, yo, Earl, we're just going to go in this alleyway here and shoot you just over here. Like,
I knew it. I knew it.
It could have been like a 911 call.
Yeah, but he literally left the keys of his truck like hidden by his truck, and he kept his wallet in the truck. Yeah. And he said like, wow, if they're going to kill me, they're not going to get my truck and wallet.
Wow.
So it was so going back to the point of the story, which is, this is very real for him.
Yeah.
And it's kind of showing that, here's another victim in this story, victim, so to speak, in this story, who's had to endure a lot of the consequences of this. I mean, we all talk about Brett going to WCW, didn't do any favors for him.
Right.
Obviously, just Earl's lived with this on his conscience for so long.
Did you talk to Scott Hall at all about if this is a work and he still believes it's a work? Like, why? What was the benefit of doing it?
I'm trying to think, like, specifically why. I just think most of what he was saying, I mean, he could be working us, we'll never know. Yeah. But I think most of his argument was just rooted in the fact that, nothing's going to happen on Vince's watch without him knowing and having full control of it. And, and then just like, a lot of people look into the conspiracy theories behind the documentary crew being there, which is another story that we have about that.
What's that story?
Okay, so this is crazy. Okay, so originally we were supposed to do 8 episodes for season 1, and in production things happen, things change, you have to adapt and make some difficult choices, and we had to actually stop production on 2 different episodes in order to finish everything. And one of those episodes, which I've talked about before, is the story of Dino Bravo. Was one of the stories working on, and we've shot all the interviews, that's all there. We just haven't done the reenactment portion of it yet.
I see.
But anyway, we shot it all in Montreal because that's where the story takes place. And Vice booked us a sound person, and they just go through an agency and they book you like a sound guy to show up to shoot.
We don't know who we're getting until we get there.
No idea. And so this guy shows up and we're like, hey, and I'm like, hey man, I'm Evan, and I just want to let you know what we're doing today. We're doing this interview. It's like a wrestling story. And he's like, oh, I've done a wrestling documentary before. And I was like, oh, really? Like, what was that? And he's like, wrestling with shadows?
No
you know?
way.
And I was like, wait, what? Sorry, what?
Yeah, we couldn't believe it.
And then
he hadn't even seen it.
He hadn't seen it. He had no idea what any of this is. No idea.
Wow.
And then we realized he was the sound guy that put the mic on Brett before Brett went in to talk to Vince.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
And so we're just like, wait a minute. Like, what?
So
And,
like first we were like, dude, you have to go home now and like watch the documentary.
yeah. Yeah.
And he did, and he came back the next day like totally blown away. He was like, "Oh my God!"
I think he came back and he was like, "They screwed Brett." and so then we just put the camera on him, and he gets like he has like a line or two in the doc where he said like the filmmakers said to him, "Hey, let's put the mic on Brett, but let's just be very low profile." So they did sort of know that was something, Brett gets a lot of heat for it, but I mean, look, if I was a filmmaker and I was the guy directing Wrestling with Shadows, I would have put a mic or two on Brett too.
Yeah.
Right. Man. So, the show should be available on demand at the time that you're hearing this. Dark Side of the Ring is on Viceland every Wednesday at 9 p.m., and the Montreal episode was this week's episode. So if you don't want, I don't know what kind of spoilers, but I want to know what was the sort of key, what was the couple of nuggets of information that you guys got that previously you had not heard or seen anywhere, that you realized like, okay, this is what's going to make this ours?
Well, it's hard to talk about without spoiling it. So I guess if
turn it off. You can turn off the podcast and
go watch it. It'll be on Viceland.com too. You can watch it.
Perfect.
The whole episode.
Okay.
If not on cable when it airs. Anyway, so I think the moment for us was totally by accident, which was we chose to interview Jim Cornette about this episode. Basically because Jim Cornette was there and he's insanely entertaining.
Yeah.
And that was what we decided, was like, well, he's going to be able to go off on this. And he's also like, such a purist.
Yeah.
And so he's going to give you that perspective of, what the history is of the business and people doing what's right for business, that whole kind of vibe. And so we went in to do this interview, and as we're setting up, he told us, he's like, well, there's something that I've never told anybody before. And I was like, really? And he's like, well, I don't really care what people think of me anymore, and I don't leave the house, so, maybe we should do it here. And he's like, I called Dave Meltzer yesterday and told him I'm going to say this on the show. And so he was like, gearing up that our thing was going to be the arena that he was going to drop this bit of information that's never been out, which was, if you've seen the episode now, hopefully you have.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
He came up with essentially the inspiration for the sharpshooter spot in the match, where Shawn was going to use Bret Hart's own finishing move on him in order so the ref could ring the bell, and you'd have Bret in that compromising position, and then you'd be able to screw him essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and the fascinating thing for us is he told us that, but a lot of people, like I said, have claimed responsibility for things in the wrestling business, or in this instance, claim responsibility for something they wish they could take back, which is kind of funny. But in this story, it was cool because he really, if you go to Jim's house, it's heaven. It's heaven for the three of us,
mm-hmm.
in terms of like just how much stuff he has, like memorabilia, collectibles, things meticulously organized. And I could spend weeks there.
It's like a museum.
It's a museum. It's incredible. And so it was cool to like see that in the episode, which you see, and then he gives you a history lesson of basically where the first Montreal screw job happened, because there was a screw job that took place in Montreal in the 30s, which involved one wrestler putting the other wrestler in his own headlock maneuver, so the ref could catch him and disqualify him. And back then, titles changed hands on disqualifications. And so it was literally a real screw job to get the title onto the other person, because back in those days, any territory that had the belt, it meant millions of dollars of revenue. So it was kind of like even more of a shady type thing, Mm-hmm. And so anyway, he tells a story in the episode where when Vince and Vince Russo and Jim Cornette are all at Vince McMahon's house, and they're trying to come up with what's a finish that'll be success or will be something Brett will go for. What can we do? What's a solution? And everybody at that time was sort of saying, "Oh, just screw Brett. Like, this is what we would have done in the old days. Like, he doesn't want to play ball. You know, let's do this." And then Jim was the one that told the story of this leave it to Jim to tell this 1930s obscure thing that happened where, you know, this screw job had happened. Or actually, it's actually called a double cross is what it's really called. A screw job is actually not the right terminology, according to him. And so the original double cross was then, and he told everybody this story. And then he said, well, what if Sean got Brett in the sharpshooter, and then Brett
get the referee in on it?
Yeah, you get the referee in on it, and then, you know, you'd have to put Brett in a situation to expose the business, which he wouldn't do because, you know, he comes from this strong background with his father and the lineage. And so, you know,
they never would have thought that Brett would have went to the press like after this.
Right.
Knowing what they know about just how seriously he takes the business. And of course he did. And then it all spiraled out of control and everything. So that to us was like,
that's amazing.
Whoa, that's so cool that he decided to share that.
Yeah.
But didn't then Vince Russo turn around and go like, no, that's not true. I thought of it.
Yeah. So, well, we were interviewing Vince Russo for a different story. And then, you know, he said he wanted to throw down on that. And I was like, well, he was there. Let's ask him.
Yeah.
You know, what happened? And of course, he didn't recall any of that and just basically said that he had come up with the sharpshooter spot out of pure frustration, you know, but he doesn't have the sort of like laborious history lesson and, you know, very detailed Cornette motivation. And so it's just interesting. It's not necessarily like we didn't put Vince Russo in the episode because that's, you know, factual or infactual. It's just part of the whole thing. The whole story, if you look at it from, you know, bird's eye view, is that there is so much mythology behind this crazy thing.
How do you guys feel? You know, you worked on these things for years. They finally get out to the eyes. How do you feel about the criticisms that you've gotten? I think Dave Meltzer has been a little critical of some of it, I think, on Twitter. And I know, you know, I think, he said something about the Montreal episode specifically, I believe.
He did.
And obviously, after the Macho Man and Elizabeth episode aired, Hogan went out on Twitter and said that, you know, you guys had gotten a bunch of stuff wrong and that he hadn't been he would have straightened you guys out if he had been asked to be a part of it. I believe, you know, I'm parafrasing, obviously. I don't have the tweets in front of me.
Yeah. And he was asked to be part of it.
And he turned you down.
Yeah, he had declined, So and which is funny. Yeah. But the the thing really is, like, any of the criticisms or the debate, especially that I think Montreal Screwjob is a subject specifically people are very passionate about and are very opinionated about. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really fun, personally, not to, you know, just sound like that. But I think it's fun that, you know, we can take all of the angles that are in the episode and then now we can talk about it and there's something to debate and there's something to, you know, take apart essentially. And, you know, Dave Meltzer, obviously, who we respect a lot, you know, as the person for 20 X amount of years, who's just really 30 maybe, who's really been like the one journalist voice in wrestling for so long, or like at least one of the first. And I think, you know, his expectation for the show, you know, probably is a more linear laying of the facts, you know, and kind of putting all the information out there, all the dates, all the contract things. I'm just assuming, I don't know for sure what his actual issue is with it.
We haven't seen the episode yet.
We don't even know if he's seen it yet. So, I mean, there's that too. I think he's heard from people that have warned him that he's not going to like it. And so anyway, you know, we tried to, in the edit, I remember in the very first edits we had of the Screwjob episode, we did try and kind of approach it with all of the facts because we got them, you know, people talk about them and we have them, and we put that all together. And then we just found that when we showed people who didn't know anything about wrestling or this story, it just wasn't, it was boring. It was kind of this thing where it's like, you know, there's not much personality. It's a little sterile, you know, and there's all this information that I don't need to know. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, you know, we only have 44 minutes to try and like summarize the JFK assassination story of wrestling,
Yeah.
And so we found out that it's much more interesting to look at this story through all angles and to look at it as something where there's so many different points of view. You don't know what's real and what's fake. And that really speaks to the theme of the whole series.
Yeah.
And like, yeah, there's moments where we're more journalistic and we have to be, but I think there's also moments where, we're being journalistic about how subjective the wrestling industry is.
Yeah, and the fun, for me, one of the most fun things about this business is the blurred lines between reality and fiction.
And people shooting on each other. And...
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, guys, I appreciate you guys making the time. Of course, Evan Hunsey, the producer, Jason Eisner, the director of Darkside of the Ring. It airs Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Viceland on cable. You can also go to Viceland.com. Right now I'm looking at the website, and I can see that the Macho Man and Liz episode is available, and the Killing of Bruiser Brody episode is also available. So if you want a taste of what the show is, I would check it out. I mean, I think it's cool to have a lot of these stories kind of encapsulated in a 44-minute version for wrestling fans and non-wrestling fans alike, to just be able to, kind of throw it on and go like, yeah, this is the 44-minute version of this extremely complex story. And I think that relates to pretty much every episode. But I think it's super cool that it exists and that it's on Viceland and that it's kind of a more mainstream look at these stories that for so long have been reserved for the super, super, super wrestling fan. So great job, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate that. Yeah.
It's now time for this week's State of Wrestling.
Yeah, it is State of Wrestling time here on Not Sam Wrestling. You know what we do. Break down the top 5 stories of the week, according to yours truly, the last professional broadcaster, and try to make some sense of this world of professional wrestling, of sports entertainment. Let's figure out what's going on here, and let's all do it together. Of course, if you want to see video of the entire State of Wrestling segment every week, if you want to watch it live, as I do it every week, the only place you can do that is at patreon.com/NotSamWrestling. Sign up, become a Not Sam shill, and you will get all the benefits that all the other shills have been getting for quite some time now. Let's get into it. Huge week, Superstar Shakeup week, so there's a lot to talk about as it all unfolds. It also seems like with the Superstar Shakeup, not only do we start looking at who has what going on for them, but who doesn't have what going on for them. And that's where we go with story number 5. And one can only assume a decision made by Luke Harper, because he felt like there was not a lot going on for him. And that is Luke Harper, somebody who, interestingly enough, for all these years, has really only tweeted out, it's insert day of the week. You know what that means. For all this time, only to find out that he can talk. Over WrestleMania weekend leading to it, he found out that all he had was a match at Access, and he said, don't say all I have is a match at Access. I'm going to tear the house down. And anybody that watched Luke Harper versus Dominik Dijakovic over on When Worlds Collide on the WWE Network, they all said the same thing. Those guys tore the house down. They stole Access, that's for sure. Luke Harper was on a mission to have one of the best matches of his career. Last year at WrestleMania, the Bludgeon Brothers stood in the middle of the ring, the new SmackDown Tag Team Champions. This year, Luke Harper was at Access, having a match at When Worlds Collide. And, I obviously was not terribly satisfied with what had happened. He's been out with an injury for a while, but apparently he's been fine since February. And the WWE creative team, however you want to call it, he says had nothing for him. It's the same thing. If you go back and listen to the interview that I did with him here on the podcast, he talks about how the last time he had an injury, the stress and the awfulness that was the purgatory of not being back but not being out, and how tough that was for him before he found the Bludgeon Brothers. To have the Bludgeon Brothers taken from him due to injury. Eric Rowan finds his spot right around Royal Rumble time. A few weeks after that, Luke Harper is ready to compete again, but guess what? Bludgeon Brothers aren't coming back. Eric Rowan has a spot with Daniel Bryan. What are we going to do with Luke Harper? I don't know. He appears to be in the best shape of his life. He's moving around like $1 million. What are we going to do with him? There's not much to do. So, not only does Luke Harper break from tradition of not speaking by putting out a picture of a note on Twitter. I wonder if when Jack on Twitter said that there can only be however many, 200 characters, whatever the character limit is on Twitter, I wonder if he realized how many people would just be screenshotting the Notes app and using as many characters as they damn well pleased. Because that's what Luke Harper did to hype up the fact that he was taking his Access match for When Worlds Collide at WrestleMania weekend very, very seriously, and that he was going to tear the house down. He delivered on that promise, only to go forward, post another screenshot of another note this week that said he had asked for his WWE release. There's no confirmation that WWE has granted that release, but just the fact that he's asking for his release puts him with a club of people that also, not far away, fairly recently asked and received their releases. I'm talking about Ty Dillinger. I don't think TJ Perkins asked for his release, but he was given his release. There was a grouping of people that happened not too long ago, and it seems like Luke Harper may be added to that. At the same time, Alexander Wolf is on Twitter, and he's tweeting about the dissolution of Sanity. Eric Young was, of course, drafted to Monday Night Raw without the other members of Sanity. Killian Dane, not on the list. And Alexander Wolf, not on the list. So, I would have thought that they would try to form some tag team between Killian Dane and Alexander Wolf and have them stay on SmackDown. But the way Alexander Wolf was tweeting, it was not like he was saying goodbye to Eric Young, who's heading to Raw, but it was almost like he was leaving. Then, of course, you have the Sasha Banks situation, which is just as weird as it gets. She hasn't been on TV, I don't think, since WrestleMania. I don't think she was on the Raw after WrestleMania, unless I'm wrong. But, rumors abound. We talked about the rumors last week about her not being satisfied at WWE. Bayley was back on Raw this week without Sasha Banks. Bayley went over to SmackDown this week without Sasha Banks. There was reference, though, to Sasha Banks, not only from Corey Graves on commentary, when I believe he said something about Sasha Banks losing her ball and quitting the game, but Bayley not being able to get Sasha Banks on the phone on TV. That would lead me to believe that even if there isn't some grand storyline being told, that the WWE... Look, conventional wisdom would tell you that the WWE is aware of Sasha Banks' situation and they have a plan for this. But at the same time, unconventional times call for unconventional means. Dean Ambrose, it leaked, I guess. It was on the internet months ago that he was going to be leaving after WrestleMania, and WWE acknowledged it. Not only acknowledged it, but acknowledged it through storylines to the point where coming up on Sunday on the WWE Network, they have the last ride of the Shield together in some kind of WWE Network special. So, who knows? Who knows what's going on with Sasha Banks? If this is some kind of grand story arc that is going to be unfolding before our eyes, or if the WWE is simply acknowledging the reality of what's happening and moving with it and going with it and being fluid as the WWE tends to be. I don't know, but I'm interested in seeing. I'm going to be following Alexander Wolf and Sasha Banks closely. And, I'm Luke Harper, if granted his release, and personally, I think if a person asks for their release, why not give it to him? But, I think that, look, being outside the WWE is not an easy thing. WWE makes it easy to make a living. Easier anyway than being on the independents. Kurt Hawkins was on the podcast, and he talked about that. Like, look, he did make a great living on the independents when he was out of the WWE, but it was really, really difficult. It was constant work and constant work and constant work. Luke Harper is a tremendous, tremendous athlete. He's a tremendous sports entertainer, and he's only gotten better since he came to WWE. Do I think he has the ability to be successful? Of course I do. Wherever he is, I think he has the ability to be successful. I'm anxious in seeing what he makes out of his future the way I'm anxious in seeing what anybody makes out of their future. I think it'll be very, very interesting. Let's go to story number 4. Speaking of people's future, the familiar faces get drafted or shaken up to Monday Night Raw. The NXT Tag Team Champions make the move to Monday Night Raw. You're sitting there and you're going, Sam, you mean the War Raiders? No, of course I don't mean the War Raiders. I'm talking about Eric and Ivar, the Viking Experience. I don't remember the last time a name change got the kind of attention that the Viking Experience has gotten. Because, man, are people reacting to this negatively. I haven't seen, the only people that are being not negative about it are people saying, like, stop complaining about it. Nobody that I've seen is sitting there going like, oh, this is a great name change. Now, I come from this school of thought still. I fall in the what's in a name category for the most part. I think, look, are Eric and Ivar actually Vikings? No, they're not actually Vikings. However, they live like Vikings. And when you get in the ring with them, it feels like you're in the ring with Vikings. The experience is much like one that you would get from a Viking. Ergo, you are being shown the Viking experience. I love watching people get all twisted up about it. I think that they're a great team. And clearly, they won an 8-man tag involving the Raw Tag Team Champions. So it's not like they were brought from NXT, renamed the Viking Experience because the WWE plans on making them look like fools. For whatever reason, the Viking Experience is now the Viking Experience. Do I think it's the greatest name for a tag team in the world? No. Do I think that Eric and Ivar, I almost called them different names. Do I think that Eric and Ivar are awesome enough that it's not really going to matter? Yeah. I think at the end of the day, whatever they're called is going to catch on. Oh, that's Eric and Ivar, the Viking Experience. I think after you say it a few times, it'll just be what you call them. You know what I mean? Like, you'll always kind of know, like, yeah, their name before was really a little, it was edgier, shall we say. But realistically, you're going to sit there and you're going to go, that's just what their name is. And you're going to call them that, The same way Andrade, Cesaro, all these guys that lost either their first or last names, nobody calls them by their first or last names. Honestly, when Bryan Danielson became Daniel Bryan, everybody was like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. How is that going to catch on? And Bryan Danielson has become a foreign name to most people. So, they're going to be on Raw. They're going to do great. They're going to win their matches. And I think eventually we'll just all get used to it. It's part of the game. It's part of the game. Story number 3. The Rock is on the cover of Time magazine. That's a big deal. There's not that many magazines left that it's a big deal to be on the cover of. But I would say Time magazine is one of them, especially when the subject of the article is the 100 most influential people. I'm sure that has a lot to do with social media, but The Rock is one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people. Huge. I think everything The Rock does is huge for WWE, is huge for pro wrestling. I mean, he continues to make these massive mainstream strides. And everything he does allows, I believe, wrestlers to be taken more seriously. And I also think it makes it so that when somebody in this world of sports entertainment wants to go beyond the squared circle, it's not this alien concept. It's not this crazy idea anymore, because now it's been done. It's very, very difficult. It's only been done to this level once, but it has been done. Even Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan was so big in the world of sports entertainment that he became a household name, that just his image became iconic. Iconic. And I don't mean, iconic with 2 eyes. That's dumb. But I mean iconic, as in he is and was an icon. But he never achieved the success outside of the squared circle that he achieved inside of the squared circle. The Rock, on the other hand, became one of the biggest WWE superstars of all time, then left the ring and became an even bigger superstar in the mainstream world. I think that's good for everybody involved. I think that's good for fans. And on one level or another, he still embraces his past as a WWE superstar and will always pop up. Even in the Fighting With My Family movie. Maybe we didn't see The Rock at WrestleMania, but anybody that went to see Fighting With My Family saw The Rock cutting a promo, calling people jabronis, being The Rock again. So the fact that he is not in a place in his career where he's trying to push his past behind him, where he's trying to hide the fact that this is where he came from, he actually embraces all parts of his journey. And I think that that's really, really good for all of us as fans. So story number 2 leads me into the Superstar Shakeup, but that'll be story number 1. Story number 2 has to do with SmackDown and the way SmackDown ended. Story number 2 has to do with the fact that the big dog, Roman Reigns, is on SmackDown. He gave Vince McMahon that Superman punch. Now, if you look at it, my perspective is I'm sitting there, Kofi Kingston, Roman Reigns sent out a tweet about SmackDown being his yard, and Kofi Kingston sent out a tweet with emojis going, I don't know about that. Whoa, why don't you take it easy right there? Kofi Kingston has had the WWE Championship for 2 weeks, and already Roman Reigns has showed up to kind of take the reins, no pun intended, although, did you hear, I believe that Elias said Reigns in his promo. He is now, in his promos, he's giving a little head nod to whoever's about to jump him, which I think is great. I love it. I thought Elias was great. I love Vince McMahon coming out and saying the big signing is Elias. I thought that was great. Because knowing Elias, there is that thing where, of course, we think it's going to be Roman, but we never know. It could just be Elias, It wouldn't have been that outside of the box for the Elias character. But look, I think Kofi's got an uphill battle. One of the reasons when I did my Superstar Shakeup last week on the show, some people said that clearly I had a bias for Raw because I put all the big stars on Monday Night Raw. And that's not true. If you go back and listen to it, I put a lot of the big good guys on Monday Night Raw. And I moved a lot of the big bad guys to SmackDown. And my thinking in doing that was, let Kofi Kingston have that spotlight. Because if you start moving big good guys from Raw over to SmackDown, it's going to be a lot tougher for Kofi Kingston to maintain his spot as the number one person, the title holder on that brand. Now, I don't think that Roman Reigns and Kofi will be anywhere near each other right away, because I don't think that the WWE would want to do away with the goodwill that Roman Reigns has built up. And I think that Roman Reigns coming in, swooping in, and taking Kofi Kingston's WWE Championship would do just that. I think the best thing they can do with Roman Reigns is put him in a high-profile rivalry right away, but far away from the WWE Championship. Do I think that Roman Reigns will be the WWE Champion? Yeah. I think that is where this is heading. But I don't think he should take it off of Kofi Kingston. I think maybe Kofi will end up losing it around. Here's what I would do. I would let Kofi hold on to it until about SummerSlam. Have a bad guy take it from Kofi Kingston at SummerSlam. And then just in time for Fox to take over SmackDown duties in October, that's when Roman can be crowned the WWE Champion. I mean, realistically, the only reason that Roman Reigns is on that brand is to be champion. Now, I don't know. It depends on what you want to do with Lars Sullivan, because Lars Sullivan is on SmackDown. So, one method you could do is to put Lars Sullivan and Roman Reigns together right now. However, that would mean the first rivalry that Lars Sullivan has would clearly be losing to Roman Reigns. What I would consider, I think a possibility would be to build Lars up until SummerSlam, have Lars versus Kofi at SummerSlam, which almost had, well, not quite. I was going to compare, because it has more to do with comparing Lars Sullivan to Brock Lesnar. But, you know, when Brock Lesnar and The Rock had their SummerSlam match for the WWE Championship, I don't think people thought that Brock was going to win, and he did. I like the idea of Lars Sullivan going to SummerSlam to challenge Kofi Kingston for the WWE Championship, and Lars Sullivan actually winning the WWE Championship. And then once we get to October, we start SmackDown on Fox with Roman Reigns chasing Lars Sullivan for the WWE Championship. And either you take the title off Lars Sullivan right away in October, or you build that story starting in October and then over the course of a few months get it back on Roman Reigns. But I think that is where things are headed. Now, you know, the thing about Kofi Kingston is, regardless of where this title reign goes, nobody will ever be able to take away his WrestleMania moment or the story that led to WrestleMania. That is officially cemented in the books. He could lose the WWE Championship tonight at a house show, and it would not take away anything that happened at WrestleMania. I mean, you go back and look at these title reigns. You go back and look at WrestleMania 30 when Daniel Bryan won the WWE Championship. It was the culmination of this yes movement that was never supposed to happen. He ended up having to vacate the title really quickly after that. But guess what? Nobody really thinks about that. Look at Rey Mysterio going to WrestleMania and winning the WWE Championship, or the World Heavyweight Championship, I believe. That was one of those moments that was never supposed to happen. And it did, and there's just no way you can ever take that away from him. Now, the title reign itself, not as memorable. But the moment lives forever, you know? And you can point to a lot of moments like that. And I think Kofi has that moment. You know, I think having a nice run for Kofi leading into the summer is just what the doctor ordered. And I don't think that Kofi will ever sort of go back down. I think Kofi will, from now and forever, be in that sort of main event spot. You know, I think that Kofi will forever be in that conversation of WWE champion. But I'm just trying to think realistically here. Let's get to, let's get to story. And I don't think either. We'll see. It remains to be seen. Some people are worried that Roman Reigns is going to be the spotlight of SmackDown, while Kofi Kingston, WWE champion, is not. I think that would be a grave mistake on the part of WWE. I think that as long as Kofi Kingston is WWE champion, he should be treated as the top guy. I think there should be a little resistance. I think that Roman Reigns should have a little bit of a mountain to climb. I think that it would make Roman Reigns a little bit more relatable. And I think that realistically, regardless of why he was gone, he's gone for 6 months. He does have some building that he needs to do. So I think 6 months, well, what is it? I think building Roman through the summer, keeping him away from the WWE Championship picture, and having a nice build going up for him, headed towards the WWE title in the fall, is the best thing that you can do for Roman Reigns. You know, I mean, I think eventually he has to be the champion. That's just the position that he's in. But we'll see. We'll see. In the meantime, I think Kofi should just be kicking ass. And just, you know, and here's the thing about Kofi Kingston. We say all this now, right? We say all this now that, okay, let's think that around the summer, Kofi maybe loses the WWE Championship to somebody like Lars Sullivan, right? We think that now. However, Kofi was never supposed to win the WWE Championship at WrestleMania. Kofi wasn't in this conversation 2 months before WrestleMania. So who knows, right? This is the way we look at things now. But if Kofi Mania continues to run past WrestleMania and through the summer, if Kofi becomes, but if Kofi remains undeniable, then what can we do but leave Kofi in the position that he's in? It could get very, very interesting. It could get very, very interesting. But that means going to arenas. And it doesn't mean booing Roman Reigns. Right? If you don't want Roman Reigns to be champion, you don't boo Roman Reigns. Because he still gets the loudest reaction of the night. He still is the biggest superstar who gets the loudest reaction. You should cheer the person that you want to be champion. If you want Kofi Kingston to remain WWE champion, you need to go to arenas and cheer your butt off for Kofi Kingston. That's the voice that needs to be heard. Not the voice of disapproval for one superstar, but the voice of approval for a superstar. The voice of approval for Kofi Kingston is so much more valuable than any voice of disapproval for Roman Reigns that it's not even a contest. So go out there. If you want Kofi to be champion, cheer for Kofi. Story number 1 is the results of the Superstar Shakeup. Of course, as we mentioned, we've got Roman Reigns and Lars Sullivan both on SmackDown. And we thought Lars Sullivan was going to be on Raw. He showed up on Raw, but then he showed up on SmackDown, and the announcement was official. Lars Sullivan coming to SmackDown. Big. The Intercontinental Champion Finn Balor is on SmackDown. Now, I said that one of my picks was putting Samoa Joe on Raw and leaving Finn Balor on Raw too, so both titles would be on Raw, and then you'd have to figure it out. It appears that instead, they did that with Finn Balor in reverse, and they put Finn Balor on SmackDown, but did not move Samoa Joe as of right now. Elias, of course, we saw at the close of SmackDown, moving over to SmackDown. I don't know how that's going to pan out. It's a big name for SmackDown for sure. But, it's just become such a fixture on Raw to have that Elias segment that SmackDown being only, a third shorter than Raw. Are the Elias segments going to be the same? Are they going to be just as long? Are they going to be just as frequent? Who knows? Ember Moon, Bayley, and Kairi Sane all go over to SmackDown, along with Liv Morgan and Mickie James. That's Bayley, Ember Moon, Kairi Sane, Liv Morgan, Mickie James. 5 women all going over to SmackDown. That's a lot of women. Now, the Iconics apparently still staying on SmackDown too, but, they're the women's tag team champions, which means they'll be going from show to show if need be, right? I think that the reason so many women have been moved to SmackDown is because that's where that tag division is going to get built. And we saw it, Bayley comes on, booed, by the way, which shocked me, Montreal. You're bad people. Booing Bayley. How dare you? Bayley comes out, and she says that she's on SmackDown as a singles competitor and proceeds to have a tag match with Ember Moon as her tag partner. I feel like that must be why so many women were moved over to SmackDown, because the tag division is going to get built over there with teams like, Asuka and Kairi Sane getting put together. I don't know why you wouldn't just move Io Shirai over to SmackDown as well, unless Io Shirai is going to have some more time in NXT and be a singles breakout. But yeah, and I guess, if singles victories are not in the cards for Asuka right now, I guess becoming a tag team champion would be good too. But I would love to see Asuka back being a dominant singles champion. Liv Morgan, of course, all over social media, very emotional about leaving the Riot Squad. Ruby Riot and Sarah Logan and Liv Morgan all came over together, kind of a mishmash of NXT stars that they packed into one faction. And it worked, man. The Riot Squad really worked for all 3 of those people. Now, I would think that Sarah Logan will somehow be packed in with the Viking Experience, because she also appears to be living through that experience herself. So I wouldn't think that Ruby Riott and Sarah Logan stay a team over on Raw. I would think that Ruby Riott goes singles and Sarah Logan goes singles, but is also part, the connection between her and the experience of the Vikings is acknowledged. Who else do we have? 205 Live, Lars Sullivan, we already mentioned. 205 Live is going to suffer. We've got Buddy Murphy and Cedric Alexander both leaving 205 Live. Buddy Murphy comes to SmackDown. I like seeing, I think it's going to be tough for 205 Live. They're going to need some signings, unless the show is going away. I don't know. But it's always good to see guys from 205 Live get the opportunity to shine on the main roster. They always have amazing matches on these pay-per-view pre-shows. They always have good matches on 205 Live. So I think Mustafa Ali probably kicked open a lot of doors. As successful as he's been on the main roster, I think that that's what kind of gave the head nod to say, okay, let's see if these 205 guys have what it takes. And if anybody does, I think Buddy Murphy does. I'm very interested to see what Buddy Murphy does as a single star on the main roster. Bobby Roode and Chad Gable have been broken up as Chad Gable is coming back to SmackDown. And, I think Chad Gable, I would probably say that Chad Gable should probably go back together with Shelton Benjamin because his whole identity was based around Bobby Roode over on SmackDown. Over on Raw. Unless you're going to completely repackage Chad Gable, which could work too. I think you're going to need a new partner for him where we can go back to kind of embracing the collegiate style wrestling of Chad Gable. Apollo Crews coming over to SmackDown, which I think is a good move. He could have a little bit more opportunity to step out from the pack. And then Heavy Machinery is officially a SmackDown tag team. I think wherever Heavy Machinery goes is good news. I'm a big Heavy Machinery fan, and I think they've done really, really good so far on the main roster. The SmackDown Tag Division, who are the tag champions right now are the Hardy Boys. I don't know who you cheer for between the Hardys and Heavy Machinery, but I'm there for it. Over on Raw, Raw got a ton of male superstars. Raw got a ton of big male superstars, which I predicted would probably happen. AJ Styles goes over to Raw. I think the best possible move for AJ Styles. There was nothing left for him to do on SmackDown. He was stagnating beyond belief. Had a good match with Randy Orton at WrestleMania. Head over to Raw. Do your thing. The Miz moves over to Raw. It seems, though, that the Shane McMahon rivalry is going to continue over on Raw. So, I guess it's just in front of a different set of eyes. But it does seem like every superstar shakeup, they just trade Miz back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. I would love to see him, by the way, at some point go back to being a villain and chasing Seth Rollins for the Universal title. I think, Miz is way overdue for a WWE or Universal title run, or at least a chase for it. And I hope that happens. Ricochet and Aleister Black go to Raw, which I think is a great move. Eric and Ivar, the aforementioned Viking Experience, are on Raw. Regardless of what you want to call them, good for them. Andrade and Zelina Vega are on Raw. I think Andrade fits right in with that AJ Styles conversation. He needed to be freshened up, and I'm glad that he's being freshened up on Raw. However, Rey Mysterio is also going to Raw. Honestly, if you told me next week on Raw, for the next 10 weeks on Raw, we're going to see Rey Mysterio versus Andrade, I'd be fine with it. I'd be fine. Let them just go at each other forever, and I'd be absolutely fine with it. But Rey Mysterio also on Raw. Big move, the Usos are on Raw. I can't believe there's going to be a television show where the Usos are on it, and we're sitting there looking at Zack Ryder and Kurt Hawkins and calling them tag team champions. That has to be short-lived. I think the Usos bring up the tag division wherever they go. The tag division has to come up to the Usos level, and I think that that's what's going to happen on Monday Night Raw. We saw Naomi go over to Raw. She teamed with Bayley. However, Bayley's gone, but Naomi is on Raw. I guess EC3 is on Raw. He got thrown through the stage this week, so, who knows what his role is going to be on Raw. I would love to know what he did to get under whoever's skin, because clearly EC3 is not a favorite anywhere. Lacey Evans is a Raw superstar, which, by the way, I loved that they were doing exactly what I hoped that they were doing, what I talked about last week, in that Becky Lynch is not a unified champion. She is a champion on each show, which means she will be on each show. And over on SmackDown, you have people like Ember Moon saying they want the SmackDown Women's Championship. And over on Raw, you have Lacey Evans saying she wants the Raw Women's Championship. Every pay-per-view, Becky defends one of the titles, but every show, you've got different people going for different titles. I think that in order to cash in on Becky Two Belts being Becky Two Belts, she has to defend them separately. Otherwise, it's just two belts representing one title, which, who cares? And then Eric Young, as we talked about earlier in State of Wrestling over on Raw, I don't know what Eric Young does without sanity. We haven't seen Eric Young really in WWE without sanity, including NXT. So, you know, I don't know what he does over there. And 205 Live's Cedric Alexander over to Raw. So things are shaking up, and you know, I think that now WrestleMania is over. The superstar shakeup has happened. Now it comes time to really sink our teeth into stories, into the storylines behind everything that's going on. Let's find some things for all these people to do on these shows, and I think we'll be in good shape. That's what I think about the superstar shakeup. Thank you for once again being a part of Not Sam Wrestling. We will see you right here again next week. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks for listening. Follow at Not Sam on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube.
Rate, review, and subscribe. This has been Not Sam Wrestling.